Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And in our episode today, we're going to be talking about the continuing story of the evolution of banking, the lubricant that keeps the economy going no matter what era we're in. And in our first episode, we talked about Don Francisco Moreno and his chest of gold under his bed, which basically served as a source of early banking. Then we brought on the Bank of Pensacola in the 1830s with its episode trying to deal with the creation of the Alabama, Florida, Georgia Railroad. And of course, we ended that with the panic of 1837, the collapse of the bank and the railroad. We then turned to the creation of the Brent Bank in 1873, and then the First National Bank brought here by the Sullivan brothers in 1880. Beyond that came the Merchants Bank, headed by Mr. Louis Knowles, and then of course the three building and loan associations, which were created in the 80s as the mechanism which allowed people, this rush of incoming population, to build their own homes. And then finally the creation in 1892 of the Citizens National Bank, for another national bank. And of course, we mentioned also that all of these national banks were permitted to create and circulate their own currency. And we concluded episode 1 with the creation here of still another national bank brought here by Charles O'Neill and Charles Lamar, and this of course was the American National Bank. So early into the 20th century, banking was the lubricant which kept a very rapidly growing economy here going. And by the time we get to the 1903-1904 period, the First National Bank was growing so rapidly that they knew they had to expand once again. Now, there were new opportunities, of course, not only for banking, but the leaders of that bank, and of course including Francis Brent, felt that what the city also needed was more quality office space. So they began the design of a new office tower. This was a building which was to be either 8 or 9 stories tall and would be located at 215 South Palafox Street. All the plans were done, and they published a beautiful architect's rendering of this in the public press, and they were just about ready to break ground when, on Halloween night in 1905, a great fire swept through what we today call the Brent Block. That's the block surrounded by Palafox, Garden, Romana, and Balin, and virtually every building there was destroyed. And of course, that meant a great loss of office space. Well, Mr. Brent, one of the owners, and William A. Blunt, the other major owner, came together and said, we are going to rebuild very quickly, and we're going to build our structures much larger than they had been, so that we will create a new surplus of professional office space. Well, when that happened, of course, there was no need for the First National to build an 8 or 9 story tower, so they fell back and regrouped, sent emissaries throughout the South to see what the other banks were doing in terms of architecture, and they came back and decided on the creation of a Neo-Grecian style quality bank building, and that is what they built at 215 South Palafox Street. And of course, that building still stands today and is the headquarters of Miss Janet Hawley and the tax collector. Well, the new First National Bank moved into operation. The new building was completed in 1907, and they functioned well. Well, okay, we move forward just a little bit from that point, and another group of men felt, well, there was still an absence here of all that people needed in the way of banking services, because new ideas were coming into the fore. And at this point in time, a group of men who were very, well, I guess we would say very aggressive, put together the idea of still another bank, and this was become the People's National Bank, which was again be located on South Palafox Street. That bank went into being, and it would merge 3 years later with the Citizens Bank, and so we created then what many people still remember here as the Citizens and People's National Bank. Once again, a national bank which was able to cast its own currency, and of course this is something that they did. We move forward now another year to the year 1910. And by now, the American National Bank, which had been operating successfully down on the corner of Government and Jefferson Street, now felt that they had reached a point where they just had to have more more space. And so they purchased a building on the corner of Palafox and Government Street that had been erected some 30 years before. It was called the Clubs Building. It was a wooden 3-story structure. They tore that building down and began the construction then of a new tower. And this, of course, was an 11-story building, the tallest building in all of Florida at that time. And we today, with that building, of course, is still there. We've changed the names many times. But this now became the headquarters of the American National Bank. They occupied the lower two floors, and the floors above were rented to all sorts of what can we call it? All sorts of professional services. We move forward again to the latter part of 1911, and at this point in time, a rather unique development occurred. And now a group of younger men came forward, and they said, well, banking is obviously a very successful business. We can make money in it. And so they organized a bank which reused the name of a bank that we had here almost 100 years before, and they organized a new version of the Bank of Pensacola. And they opened their banking building, their banking service, in the new Blunt building on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street. And the Bank of Pensacola started out, and they had hardly gotten into business, and they were doing quite well, when another group of very aggressive young men came to them and said, we have a great idea. You know, all across South and Central Florida, people are buying up land, they're conditioning it, then they are putting it in form for sales to people up north, because Florida, the word Florida has magic in it, and people up north are snapping up lots all over Central Florida. He said, we can do the same thing here and make a lot of money, because there's a lot of land just north of Pensacola which has been cut over in the lumbering industry. We want to buy that, clean it up, package it, and offer it for sale. And we need to borrow $100,000. Well, the men at the Bank of Pensacola thought this sounded like a wonderful idea, and they made the loan. We moved forward a little over a year into the middle part of 1913, and at that point in time, another a serious recession struck the country. This was, some people said it was started because President Wilson forced an income tax on the people, but whether that was the course or not, the recession was there, and our new Bank of Pensacola had a number of loans that were a little on the shaky side, so they turned to these aggressive young men who had borrowed the $100,000 for land development, said, we need to recall the loan. And the young man said, well, we would be tickled to death to repay it, of course, but we've spent all the money, and as soon as we sell the land, we'll repay the loan. Well, the long and the short of it was, by the end of the year, this new bank failed. And when it failed, of course, many of the assets of many of our local merchants up and down Palafox and Garden Street were lost with it, because there was no federal deposit insurance at that point in time. We moved forward just another 6 months, and still another bank is founded. This time was the Malone family was at the heart of it, and they formed a bank which first of all would be called the Banking Savings and Trust Company, and they moved into the same space that had been occupied by the Bank of Pensacola. This was another local state-operated bank. It was not one of those that could issue currency, but it was a good, solid organization. Another 6 months went by, and one morning in the month of January of 1914, Francis Brent was in his office at the First National Bank, and he received a cable. And the cable announced that the firm in Liverpool, England, the firm of Crowe Rudolph, which had been the conduit for economic transactions between First National Bank and the British companies that were buying lumber through Pensacola, that the Crowe Rudolph had been unable to meet their obligations, and they had closed. And that firm owed the First National Bank here about $500,000. Well, this was a terrible blow, but Mr. Brent wasn't worried. He knew that First National had about $400,000 in gold sitting in the vault, so he felt that they were in good shape. But nonetheless, because this was a federally insured bank, they had to call in an examiner, and the man who arrived here to make the study was named Goodhart. And man was well, we won't go into the question of his name with what actually happened. He looked at the bank, the First National Bank papers and studies, made his study, and said the bank has to close. And it did. First National Bank was closed. Mr. Goodhart then waited just a couple of months, and he organized still another new bank on his own, which was called, again, the Merchants National Bank. And that Merchants Bank almost at once began to work very closely with the American National Bank, and the two worked together very nicely. There were some bad times in 1915 and 16. There was another time of economic turbulence in the country, but nonetheless, the Americans survived. And by the time we reached 1919, the American National Bank and the Merchants Bank merged. They adopted the American National Bank name, and they indeed were a part of the system here, which would continue on. And the descendants of that merger are still in operation here today. That is what has ultimately become the Wachovia Bank system here in Pensacola. Okay. We move forward just a little bit more as we come to the status of the Pensacola in the 1920s. All of these banks that we have mentioned continued on providing service. There were only two surviving home and savings groups, Pensacola Home and Savings and Mutual Federal, or First Mutual. They continued to provide basically the service of home loans, which were so necessary all through this period. The banks proceeded on. Then we come to the Depression. Now, there have been many heart-wrenching stories told about what happened to many savers across the country when the Depression came, because across the United States, hundreds and hundreds of banks failed. And of course, as they failed in those days, the insurance level was all but zero. And as a result, people would stand in line for hours hoping to get their money back, and they couldn't. Those who have seen the wonderful Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, will remember the two runs that are talked about in that film. I mention those because they might jog your memory as to what the situation was like, how frantic people became as money became scarce. Well, we move into the year 1944. We're past the Depression. We're into the middle of World War II. And at this point in time, the American National Bank is sold to the Florida National Bank chain. This is a chain which is led by financier Edward Ball, and they take the Florida National not only takes over the name, this becomes a Florida National Bank chapter, but also at that particular time they acquired the building, the 11-story building, and that would be their headquarters up into the year 1960-61. Meanwhile, the Banking, Savings, and Trust Company has prospered, and along the way it has changed its name. It becomes the First Bank and Trust Company. The First National Bank, of course, has long been gone. The Citizens and People National Bank continues its work at 215 South Palafox. And we have a generally very solid banking situation. At the end of World War II, the Woodbury interests begin the founding of a series of smaller banks on the west side of Pensacola, all of which continue on to serve us today. So as we move into the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and I won't try to bring all of this into focus for you because there have been so many, but more and more banks are founded here, many of them small private banks, some of them are branches of others. And at one point in time, about the year 1995, we had reached a point, and I didn't make the study, but I believe it probably was true, that we had more, and this includes both Escambia and Santa Rosa counties, we had more banks and bank adjuncts to stations out in the community. We had more of those to get in branches. We had more of those than we had convenience stores. That, of course, has begun to change, did begin to change, so that the consolidations are in effect. So as we talk about banking in the 21st century, it's a changed business. In the years 2007, 8, and early 9, banking across the country was in a very different mode, and many people have been and were concerned. But even though that was the case, the FDIC services made sure that, at least at this point in time, made sure that no depositor lost so long as his account was of a certain level. So that's our story of banking. It has been with us now in one form or another since the early part of the 1830s. We have it here today, and our economy prospers because of it.